Much appreciated. Oh, let's just see if this is indeed started. Okay, we're good. All right, well, let's begin by just some brief words about that term paper. I want to keep on that, giving you guys options. So today is a good day to pass for your consideration a topic about metaphysics as a science. It's what is metaphysics according to the Aristotelian tradition. And in answering this question, it would be good to explain what a science is, according to the tradition. And it would be good to identify what the principles, the subject, and the things sought after are for this science. And you can look at stuff from the metaphysics, stuff we're going to look at today, stuff from Avicenna, which we're going to look at soon, and Thomas's commentary on the De Trinitate, which we don't look at in this class. Or maybe we do. Maybe we do. Anyways, and there's actually a variety of, I think it's a good topic. There's things to look at. And a lot of the problems are coming out of today's readings. So one of the issues is, what is the subject of metaphysics? And there's various contenders. Some people think it's God. Others, it's the causes. And others, that it's being as being. Those are the main contenders. And you get some grounds in Aristotle's metaphysics for each of them. I mean, today he's going to talk about it as a theology. When he lists the sciences out, metaphysics appears as theology because it's about what's most divine, those separate existing things that are not matter. And he spends the whole first book searching after the causes.
Sorry, Dr. Albert, what do you say were the primary contenders for subject matter? Being as being God, and there's
And the causes, four causes. And actually, when we read Avicenna, he's going to take that direct question up. He's going to come down very decisively on the matter. And Thomas is going to agree with him, and I think Aristotle also agrees. So we'll find out what the subject is momentarily. But there's this idea of what a science is for Aristotle. That's a worthwhile thing to investigate. So anyways, there we are. There's a possibility. I think it's a decent one.
Doctor, that would really take more than, it's recommended like 2,000 word paper. That'd really take more discussion than 2,000 words, correct?
It could easily take more. I think within 2,000 words, you could probably deal with it.
Okay.
I haven't written it, so I have no idea what it would be, but that's my guess.
Seems like an interesting topic.
It is. Okay, well, what should we do next? I guess I should apologize because given all the wonderful material I've assigned, I will not be able to deal with it all, of course, in a detailed way that one should. And we might not get through it all, but I'll do my best. So we got to go back to stuff we had last class that I did not tackle thoroughly, so we're going to do that first. But okay, one of the reasons I assigned to you guys was from book 1, chapters 7 and 10. So we'll quickly get through that with you guys answering my questions. What is the purpose of book 1 of the Metaphysics? What do you say?
Sorry, not sure.
Okay, well, what does he do in it? There's a good, easier question. What does he talk about?
Is he like defining being? Or
No, he's not defining being.
is he talking about wisdom? Or?
He starts talking about wisdom. What is wisdom?
I forget. Was it something like the knowledge?
It's a knowledge.
Causes?
Causes. Okay. So it's a knowledge of things had through causes. What kind of causes? Regular everyday causes?
Proper causes?
Well,
Oh,
doesn't have to be proper
principles.
causes. Principles. These are the more universal sort. The principles, the causes of all things, the highest causes, we could say. Okay, well, what does he do after that? That's the first 2 chapters. Where does Aristotle go next?
He delves into the 4 causes. causes in book 3.
Mm-hmm.
As he's going through, he's surveying previous thought on the topic too.
Yeah, so we next get into a survey of thought. And why is he surveying it? There's a definite reason why Aristotle is undertaking this survey. What's he trying to find out?
See what his predecessors thought
Okay.
about the four causes and trying to glean whatever truth they have.
Yeah, more or less. What he's trying to find out is whether the causes he identified in the physics, the four causes, are well identified. Are these indeed the causes of things? Well, let's look at the predecessors, and either we'll discover that, there's more causes that we hadn't thought about, or something along those lines. And his conclusion is that yes, my four causes are good. They're both spoken of, but not spoken of clearly enough in the predecessors, and none of them has mentioned a cause beyond these. Most spoke about the material cause, that was quite clear. Agent cause, decently clear. Formal cause, more so by the Platonists, but not up to Aristotle's standards. And the final cause, they talked about the good, but he complains they didn't use the good precisely as a final cause, according to the nature that it has as a cause. Okay, so there we are. That's what happened in book 1. So our next book, Metaphysics book 2, is called book Alphaton. And the first book's Alpha, the second book's Alphaton, and the third book's Beta. Why is it called Alphaton? You guys remember?
It's a later edition.
Yeah, it's little alpha.
An appendix to one, basically.
It's not part of the main series, the original series. So whatever book 1 really begins, what it's calling for next is what we have as book 3, which is book Beta. So they inserted this other book that they have, which seems to be about metaphysics, in there. In between, and so they just called it Little Alpha. Now, at the very end, it seems to be pointing to natural science or physics. So I'm not quite sure how much it was intended as a metaphysical treatise. But anyway, there we are. We have Alphaton. Okay, so it has 3 chapters, and the beginnings and ends of it we can generally set aside. They're not that important. Not as important, at least, as the middle parts of it. So the real heart of this book is the no infinite regress argument that we find there. His assertion that there are first principles. So before we can pursue the question, what are they? What is it, sort of, to search for the nature of a thing, we got to know that the thing exists. So before we can search for what are our first principles or say anything about the first principles, we got to know that they exist. That's what's being done here.
He kind of goes about it the same way Thomas does. He lays down that God is, and then he.
So yeah, so that, and the reason why Thomas does that is that is basic Aristotelian methodology. So we start with what the name signifies, or a nominal definition. Then you search for, does it exist? That's the next thing we ask. And then we look for its real definition to try to discern that. That's the order. So science is really only about existing things. Now they might be just things existing in potency. But there's not a science of unicorns unless we discover that unicorns are a real thing that could happen. Once we have that, then you can have a real science about it. Okay, so yeah, it's exactly like what Thomas does. Okay, so if there's something that this book we could say it's about, it seems to be about truth. That's its theme. And it begins by talking about how truth is in some way easy, in some way hard. It's easy in the sense that you're always getting some of it. It's like the side of the barn, it's easy to hit, as long as you don't care where you're hitting. But it's hard to hit where exactly you want, or get the full truth. And it's also something that time is a good helper for. He doesn't say that here, but he says it elsewhere, but the idea is here. And that's why we should have gratitude for our predecessors, both the great predecessors, but also the lesser ones who prepared the way for those greater ones. So, we should be grateful for Thomas, but there's a bunch of these, at least to us, unknown medieval figures who helped prepare the way in a variety of manners. Okay, then we get, of course, the eye of the bat thing. It always pops up here and there in Aristotle. And the basic idea is that we can distinguish things which are more noble in themselves from things which are less noble in themselves. The things which are more noble are higher in the order of being. And if we draw an analogy, the one that comes to us from Plato with knowability and visibility, it's like talking about how there's some things which are more visible according to their nature and things which are less visible according to their nature. So things out in the light of day are more visible than things which are in a dark cave. However, despite that, you might be of a nature where what is less visible is actually more visible to you. And what of itself is, by its nature, more visible, more illuminated, is less visible to you because it's just too much. If you're the bat, assuming this is true about bats, that you see better in dark conditions, but when it's too illuminated, it's just too much for your eyes, you can't see it. So the idea is that human beings are not like angels, not like God, and our intellect is the sort that what is most accessible to us are things which are actually low on the totem pole of being or intelligibility. They actually have a very little share in intelligibility. But they're the kind of things that we know most readily. And we've got to work from those up to the things which are intelligible in themselves, but less intelligible to us. So we work up as best we can to know something about God, who dwells in light and accessible. We only know him in philosophy through his effects. Okay, so hopefully that whole bat thing's clear. And then we get on to the science of the truth, the episteme elephas. Here's another thing that I'll throw in for you guys' edification for when you're older and you're having children and you have to name your child. And you think, well, you might want to name your daughter after wisdom. All right, we get our word Sophia, or with a PH, right? Or you can take the Latin one, Vera. But if you want to be all sophisticated, you can use the Greek name for truth, which is aletheia. Yeah, pretty sure. Aletheia. So, Greek word for truth. So, here Aristotle identifies philosophy as the science of truth. Our translation has knowledge of truth, which is perfectly fine. So, why is it the science of truth? Well, let's take a look at that passage.
Then Denison's daughter is named Alethea.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Sophisticated man. Okay, it is right also that philosophy should be called knowledge of the truth. Episteme eletheis. Why? Well, because it's a theoretical knowledge for number one, right? Because theoretical knowledge aims at truth. Practical sciences aim at action. Metaphysics, first philosophy here, aims at truth. Okay, but compared to the other theoretical sciences, which of course are mathematics and physics, first philosophy is maximally the science of truth. Okay, well, why is that? Because not all truths are made equal. Some truths are more truthy than others. So we get this wonderful little line here. We get a very important line before that wonderful line. So I'll read both of them. Now we do not know a truth without its cause. thing has a quality in a higher degree than another thing, if in virtue of it, the similar quality belongs to other things as well. Okay, that wasn't as pithy as it might have been. So we have two important things. Number one, we do not know a truth without its cause. Number two, this thing about qualities in a higher degree.
Sorry, Dr. Oliver, where are we exactly?
We are on page 712,
Okay.
bottom of it. Okay. Okay, so the Latins had this wonderful way to encapsulate something in this brief little phrase. So this is actually, I believe it's the Latin translation of something from Aristotle's Posterior Analytics, where he gives this basic principle. And it goes like this. So this means that on account of which, propter quod, that on account of which, any given thing is, that thing is more. That on account of which a given thing is, that thing is more. An example will help make a lot much more sense of this. Fire is said to be hot. And fire is said, according to our medieval physics, to be the reason for why other things are hot. Therefore, since it is, fire is that on account of which something is hot, it itself is more so. Now, you might have encountered this principle anytime I talk about love of God above self, because there we have something which makes something lovable. So that which is itself lovable and is the reason why something else is lovable, that first thing is even more lovable. So my standard example is of the pitcher as a person. Pitcher is lovable. Why? Because the person in the pitcher, someone you love. And so who's loved more? Well, the original person. It's on account of that person that the pitcher becomes lovable. Aristotle here uses the example of fire. So, and he means to apply it to truth. So, let's talk about that Aristotelian theory of science. It's all about connecting S's and P's.
You said essence and peas.
Oh, no, S's and P's, not essence and P's.
Noah goes, I'm not a term paper.
All right. So, science is precisely when we connect a subject with a predicate, but that connection is not immediately evident to our minds, it's mediated
Sorry,
through something.
Dr. Albert, I was blowing my nose and you
Yep.
said science is about.
Connecting S's with P's. Quote me on that. Okay, where the two are not self-evident. So certain things are self-evident, like that a dog is an animal. If you know what a dog is, you know what an animal is, you know that the subject and the predicate go together. But science is not immediate grasp, is not an immediate grasp, it's a mediated grasp, where there needs to be something that's going to connect these two, because S is an M, and M is a P, therefore we can say S is P. Okay, now, in order for you to have science, it has to be demonstration, it's got to be a conclusion of a syllogism. The syllogism has to be valid. That's condition one. There are other conditions, and I'm going to mention two of them. You got to be true. The premises have to be true. You don't have science from false premises. That's very good. Okay. So here we have a case of derivative truth. This is true, but it's true because these are known to be true. back to that thing with the bat. Sometimes what the bat knows, in the case of the bat, sometimes we're like the bat and what we know is actually an effect. And we go from effect to cause. So the truth of the effect is more known to us, and therefore we arrive at a conclusion about the cause. This is not a proper scientific, it's not the perfect scientific syllogism. So my example of this, you guys remember from St. Thomas class, has to do with the twinkling of the stars. For us here on Earth, what's evident is the effect, namely that the stars twinkle. And we're able to reason back, if we come to know that things twinkle when they're far away. Oh, the stars, sorry, it's the planets, they don't twinkle. And that's evident to us, that's more known to us, but it's an effect of how close they are to us. And that ends up being the conclusion of the syllogism. That's not a proper scientific demonstrative syllogism, or at least it's not the most perfect kind. This is the quia argument. The proper perfect scientific syllogism is one where we know the cause, the real cause, and we arrive at the effect. Okay, so in this case, both what is more true, more real in reality, and what is more known for our syllogism comes first, and then we derive this. So this is going to have an absolutely greater claim on truth, both to us and considered in itself.
Oh, sorry, I was just wondering, I think the left-hand effect and cause are backward.
What's that?
Aren't effect and cause backward?
Well, with the,
Oh, no, on the left.
this one?
Yeah, shouldn't the arrow be inverted in effect and cause too?
Oh, but so this is meant to signify the imperfect type of syllogism. This is the
okay,
quia,
I understand.
and that's the propter quid.
Sure.
Okay. So where does this go? Okay, so when we have true knowledge, our premises, we're having knowledge through causes. Now this M is going to function in some way like a cause. So we have knowledge through causes, and here the cause is both more known and has a greater claim on reality. So this is true, but its truth is derivative from this truth. This is more true. Okay. So he continues, he gives that example of fire. He says, hence the principles of eternal things must be always most true. For they are not merely sometimes true, nor is there any cause of their being, but they themselves are the causes of the being of other things. All right, so the idea here is that metaphysics is going to deal with, it seems to me he's connecting with metaphysics is going to look for the causes of eternal things. And by the eternal things that have causes, at least Thomas thinks, for Aristotle, he's thinking of the heavens, the physical heavens. And we're looking for what are the causes of those things. And since they think the heavens are eternal, the causes of them are going to be even more so. They'll be the highest in being. They'll have they're going to be eternal and the causes of everything. Now, if we take a different approach to metaphysics and say, well, we're looking for the causes of all being. Well, if anything's going to be eternal and permanent, it would have to be those causes. And so because they have the highest claim of causes, they have the highest claim of being beings, and the highest claim of truth. So he concludes, so that as each thing is in respect of being, so is it in respect of truth. So here we have the assertion of the convertibility of being and true, which is another fine topic you could write on. You could write on the transcendentals. So it's an important little passage, and if you guys remember the fourth way, it's one that Thomas appeals to. Okay, but we proceed. Chapter 2. chapter 2 is the most important part of this little book. And he needs to establish here there is a first principle. And there is going to be a first principle for the reason that causes exist, so that's just assumed. And you can't have an infinite series, nor are there an infinite amount of different kinds of causes. Most of what he says is going to be dedicated to the first one, no infinite series. He takes up the not infinite in kind at the very end. And basically he says they can't be infinite in kind because then knowledge would be impossible. So he assumes knowledge is possible. It's another thing, of course, that Plato assumed. So knowledge is possible, but knowledge would not be possible if there were an infinite amount of different causes. Why? Because you only know something if you know its causes. But if there's an infinite amount of causes, you can't go through those in a finite time, he says. Okay, let's take a look at chapter 2 again. Chapter 2 begins with, has a little introductory part where Aristotle asserts that you can't have an infinite series in regards to any of the four causes. And then, after that, he goes through each of the four causes. So that's how this chapter is structured.
Dr. Over.
Yep.
Ask a question.
Yep.
So, you can only know things through their causes. What does that mean? What does he mean by that?
So we truly know something when we know its causes. So take the example of an eclipse. You might be perplexed. Why does the moon occasionally become darkened? So there's a kind of initial thing where you know, what does eclipse signify? It means that the moon is darkened. But you have a full knowledge of what it is when you know its cause. When you know that an eclipse is when the earth comes between the sun and casts its shadow onto the moon. Of course, it's for a lunar eclipse. So we know a thing when we know all its causes.
Okay. So it has to be full knowledge. But
The most perfect knowledge of a thing involves the knowledge of all its different causes. At the very minimum, you're going to need the matter and form causes in a thing, because that's what you find directly in the definition.
okay.
Sometimes you get if it has an agent, proper agent cause and a final cause. You wouldn't have that in math, though. You wouldn't have those two causes necessarily in math.
But according to Aristotle, then wouldn't you have to actually to know anything?
Know everything?
Wouldn't you have to know exactly what the being was, the first principle was?
So, it sounds like, doesn't this amount to what Plato was claiming, where you have to know the good before you can know anything?
Yeah.
I think they would say what's required is the proximate cause, not the remote cause.
Dr. Albert, returning briefly to quia and proper quid.
Mm-hmm.
I think I should remember this from Thomas, but would quia be more akin to induction and proper quid to deduction?
No, they're both deductive. They're both using the syllogism here.
Yep.
But propter quid gives you the cause, the real cause that explains why the conclusion is so. Quia produces a necessary conclusion, and therefore it can claim a kind of scientific knowledge, but it doesn't give you the proper cause. It could either give you a remote cause, or it could give you, or it could be moving from effect to cause. So quia covers actually at least two different kinds of arguments. We normally understand it as an argument from effect to cause, but it's a little bit broader than that. So, but it tells you that something is the case, and with necessity it tells you that it must be the case, but it doesn't tell you why it's the case. And the perfect scientific syllogism explains why it is. Okay, so Aristotle deals first with the agent cause, then material, final, and then lastly formal. So we get the no infinite regress argument provided with the agent cause, and so he begins by saying, of the first, the middle, and the last, I guess these must be agent causes, or maybe the last is an effect. The first is most the cause of all. I guess the last must be a, let's say it's an effect. Middle and intermediate are the same, so we're going to call this our effect. Of these, which is most the cause? Well, the middle is the cause of something, but it's not the cause of the first. So it's the cause of one thing here, but the first is the cause of everything else that's there. So the first is most the cause. Next, he says, and this is important, it doesn't matter how many middles there are. It doesn't matter if there's one, or if there's two or three or a finite number, or even if there's an infinite number, provided that there's some first. So he doesn't, not that this is actually something that could happen, but on a hypothesis where you have a first cause, an infinite amount of middles, and then the last cause, it's not going to have the problem that he's going to identify here. It might have its own special problems. But the kind of thing that he wants to reject isn't this, not right now. It's the situation where there would be no first. There's just an infinite regress. So, what if it was like this? Well, it means that all the parts ad infinitum are middles. And so this is an infinite regress where there's no first. It means everything in the series is one gigantic middle, except for, of course, the last. And so what you end up with is a situation where you have a middle, a last, but no first. But the first was the cause of the middle and of the last, so take out the first and you take out everything else. So that's how he presents the argument. It always seemed to me kind of subtle, and I was wondering if, I felt worried that a sleight of hand was, some sort of trick was being pulled on me. Wasn't quite sure if this is necessarily the case. I'm willing to trust him, willing to trust Thomas and others, that they look at this and they say, yeah, that argument works. So I'm going to trust him on it. However, as I usually give as my explanation, the big problem about these middles, about the infinite regress, is that this ends up being a potential cause. Considered in itself, it doesn't have what it takes to cause. And you keep adding these things, these movers. And the series as a whole isn't capable of doing anything. It could transmit the causality if the causality was there, but it's not. So when I tackle the no infinite regress, I need to emphasize for myself that what makes something a first is the fact it doesn't need something before it. It has what it takes to cause. Whereas a middle, or an infinite amount of middles, never consider themselves to have what it takes to cause. So, the example of if somebody's applying for a job, they want to be a writer or whatever, and I want to see, I want to know if this person can actually write. And somebody I trust testifies, this person is an excellent writer, totally trustworthy person. But then I discover this person hasn't actually read anything of the prospective employee, but is asserting this because there's somebody else who's trustworthy who has asserted this. And so we get an infinite series of trustworthy people, but no one in the series has ever seen the work. can I therefore conclude this person's a good writer? Well, say no, because no one's actually ever seen this. Or you could do it as I sometimes do with a murder case, where you got a whole infinite series of witnesses, but no one actually saw the thing happen. So these people are capable of conveying it, but none of them possess it in themselves. And so, as I've often said, they end up being one infinitely long series of zeros, and they just don't add up to anything. Okay, so there we are. That's how Aristotle presents it. As I said, there's my own interpretation that allows me to actually make sense of it. I'm willing to trust him and say, yeah, he's probably right. You could probably do it in this kind of short form way, but its subtlety still eludes me. Okay, a little word about the other causes. His treatment of material cause is kind of weird because it's not the way I would have expected it. Because when I think of material cause, I think ultimately of prime matter. And so I would have thought he's trying to argue down to say there must be some sort of potency that is not the potency of some other thing below it. But he doesn't do that. For him, it's all about arguing that what the matter is the existing composite that it comes from. And so it's more the terms of the change, where you have thing one, it becomes thing two, and these end up being the terms that make this a limited series. So it might be fire becoming air, or a boy becoming a man, and there's not an infinite amount of stages between, or at least there's two terms on each side. All I'm going to say for you guys is that that's how he's treating this. He's not treating the way I would have expected, where, you know, one thing is the matter for another thing, which is the matter for another thing, contemporaneously down to prime matter. Moving on to the final cause. Here, according to Aquinas, Aristotle gives 4 reasons why there must be a final cause. It's just easiest to approach it in terms of the difference between a useful good and something which is good in itself. A useful good is not desirable in itself. It doesn't have what it takes to move your desire. But it moves your desire because it's a means for attaining something which you do desire. And so if you take away the final cause, then you have a whole series of things which are desirable on account of another thing, but none of them is desirable in themselves. And so the claim is that an infinite series of merely useful things, but if they're not useful for anything at the end that you actually want, is not going to cause you to want it. As for the formal cause, I'll just leave that aside. Okay, chapter 3, so we'll end our review, is just another one of his methodological chapters, where he tells us that the effect that lectures produce on the hearer has to do with the lecturer's habits, their expectations, and what is customary to them, because what is customary is intelligible for that person. And so some people listen or read things with certain expectations. They expect kind of mathematical type proof or a different kind of proof, and they're going to be disappointed or in trouble if their expectations are wrong. So an important thing about becoming educated is learning how to take arguments the way they should be taken. There's expectations you should have for mathematical arguments. There's going to be different than expectations you should have for historical arguments or literary arguments. And that's what he says. Now, why exactly he decides to bring it in here, I don't know. He seems to be emphasizing that the minute accuracy of mathematics isn't to be expected in all cases. It's not to be expected in physical science. And then he seems to say that he's going to go on to treat about stuff about physical science. So I'm not sure if this is really meant for a metaphysical work. In metaphysics, you can expect certainty. The arguments that are going to be metaphysically sound are going to be necessary arguments. They're going to be the case always and not simply for the most part, as you have in natural science. Okay, well, that's our review, so let's take our 5-minute break. So I'll see you guys at 11 minutes to the hour.
Aiden's done. Sick.
Yeah, I just kind of crashed over the weekend.
Buddy.
That's
I'm not gonna touch you, but I'll pray for you.
Thanks. You going to Thunderbirds on Saturday?
I'm signed up, but I feel like I'm really behind on a lot of things.
Oh, good. We're leaving at 1 p.m. It said 7:30. Certain is.
All right. Start up again. Yeah. Okay. So, book 4, we're skipping over book 3. Book 3 is a weird book. It's a collection of all the various problems that were, I guess, around, that are spoken about in regard to metaphysics. Chances are most of them aren't your problems. And so, it's not really worth your while to spend your time reading that when you could be reading other things. So we skipped over it. And we go to book 4. And in many ways, this is where the real business of the metaphysics begins. And today's set of readings was the most far scattered of the ones I assigned. Hopefully, you guys were able to perceive something of the unity that exists within it. If you didn't, well, I'll make that clear as we go. They are chosen very purposefully. Okay, so we begin with book 4, and this line, unless it's, it comes right away. Let me just take a look in the text itself. There is a science which investigates being as being. Okay, there is an episteme, or a science. Do you have science? Yeah. Okay, a certain science which theorizes, speculates, investigates this thing. The being as being. Here's what our Latin has. Ens in quantum, usually est, ends. Being inasmuch as it's being. So you'll see this expressed in a variety of ways. Being as being qua being, which is kind of weird because the qua is Latin word. But all the times I see it written in the Latin, it never is using qua. Anyways, or being inasmuch as it is being. So, what it amounts to saying, you're studying being precisely as it is a being. You're not studying, so what would be different than this? Studying being inasmuch as it's quantitative. Studying being inasmuch as it's subject to motion. Yeah, those are beings, and those are describe what some beings are like. But this science is about being considered just in itself. What can we say about being? Which is to say, what can we say about all being? What properties does a being have just because it's a being? Well, that part's what comes next. And those things which are present to it according to itself. All right, so once again with the Aristotelian science is all about connecting those S's and P's together. So one of the things we do, for instance, in geometry is come to the conclusion that triangle, there's our S, and the interior angles of 180 degrees go together. And it's important that you match up the predicate with the right subject. So that's another important thing, because that predicate doesn't properly belong to a more general subject, to shape, right? We can't say shape is something which has interior angles of 180 degrees. That's not true. Sometimes it's true when the shape is a triangle. Other times it's not true. But also an isosceles. An isosceles is always going to have interior angles of 180 degrees. But it has that precisely because it's a triangle. And so this is the proper subject that the P has to belong with. So we're looking for those things that properly belong to being as being, not to being in as much as it's this or that sort of thing. So what are the properties that belong to being in as much as it's being? That's what we're after in this science. And it was this science that our pre-Socratics were effectively doing, because they sought principles. Principles of what? Well, they sought the principles of all things. So we could say they were looking for the principles that pertain to being, just simply as being, not some being, but all being. Okay, so therefore, the kind of principles that we're after are the principles of being as being. Okay, then I had you guys read the next chapter in book 4. We're going to read more of book 4 next class. But I decided this time to hold it off because it belongs to a different topic. It belongs to the issue of defense of the axioms. So what does he say here? He indicates the unity of the science. So one of the questions raised earlier was, does it belong to one science, this one science of metaphysics, to deal with both substance and accident? Well, no, what's Aristotle's answer? Does it belong to metaphysics to deal with both?
I don't think I understand the question itself.
Okay. That's okay. Aiden, do you happen to know? Does it belong to it to deal with both substance and accident?
Stuff I highlighted doesn't seem to refer to that.
Okay. So most of the time here in this chapter is spent explaining an idea of analogy. Now, the kind of analogy in question is called prose-hen analogy. There's various kinds of analogy, and this is the prose-hen sort. Prose-hen literally means towards one. There, I'll do it in what we call those Latin letters. Towards one analogy. He gives 2 examples. The example of the healthy and the example of the medical. So, many things are said to be healthy. For instance, the animal, or you, the animal. So you're healthy, but so also would medicine. It's supposed to be a pill. That's healthy. And exercise. And I don't think he says here, but normally urine is brought in as an example because it's a sign of health. So certain exercises, we say that's healthy. Or this blood we've taken from you is healthy or whatever, because it's a sign of health. So of these things which are healthy, there's one which is properly speaking healthy. It's the one that exists in you, the animal. Other things receive that name because of their relation to it. Because the medicine will produce health, or the diet you're on will conserve your health, we call that healthy. And then he you could do something along those lines with medical. Now, being. Being is said in many ways. What does he identify as the central meaning? What is being in its principal sense? No?
Can't recall.
Abe?
You only had us read like the first page of chapter 2, right? Okay.
So where are we right now?
It would be 732.
He says substance.
Substance is the answer.
If then this is substance, it will be a substance that the philosopher must grasp the principles and causes. Last sentence there.
So, I won't write them all out, but 10 categories are categories of being, but one is being properly speaking or per se. What exists properly speaking? The dog, the human, the substance. Other things are said to be beings because by them, substance exists in a certain way. So a quantity, 5 feet, is a substance, is a being because by it you are in a certain way. Same thing with quality and so on. So
Because it
all,
because it like relates to substance? Okay.
and actually this is going to turn out to be in the very definitions of these things. So they're all understood with reference to substance. And that's why they're called being. Okay. Then what he says to answer his question is that it belongs to one science, not only to deal with something according to, what would you call it, a univocal sense of the term, but to all of the things that are said to be that thing by this pros-hen relation, which is to say, one science that studies health is going to be the same science that deals with a healthy diet and what are the signs of health and what would be a healthy exercise. So likewise, the science of being as being does deal with substance and accident. As we're going to see later, though, it's going to primarily deal with substance, and then Aristotle is going to pretty much leave accidents out of it. That's not always going to be the case in metaphysics, but it certainly seems to be the case here. Substance, metaphysics becomes a science of substance for Aristotle.
Dr. Oliver, so you said, so substance is being, properly speaking. All accidental qualities can be called being because of their relation to substance. There are ways in which a being exists.
Yeah, I'm adding that in there, but that's a standard thing that Thomas would say.
Okay.
An accident is something by which you exist in a certain way. It's especially the case with qualities and quantities. Okay. So this idea of analogy, analogical unity of this science, it's important to know. Okay. So let's move on to probably the most important, at least the central part of the assigned readings, chapter 7 of book 5. Book 5 is a weird book. As far as books go, might be the weirdest. It's like a giant dictionary, a philosophical lexicon. And yet it seems to be something that was intended as part of the main series. And he could be wrong about that, but he does refer back to it. And so what he does in this book is he goes through various terms and he talks about all the ways that they can be used. And I had originally thought this would be a very useful book and I would have liked to have more readings from it, but when I read through it last time I was struck by how much this is meaningful if you're a Greek speaker it loses a lot of its meaning if you're not a Greek speaker. You know, you're not, I mean, this is not the way we use these terms, so why bother mentioning it? And Aristotle here is very often concerned with just language and not with philosophical aspects of it. He'll draw from it later to do the philosophy stuff, but not necessarily right now. Chapter 7, however, gives us a guide map to the whole of metaphysics. So, being is said in many ways. 700, turn to page 760 if you care to follow along here. So he says, things are said to be, he has two different senses, in an accidental sense, and the English here is by their own nature. More literal translation would be according to itself. I'll spare you guys the Latin and the Greek, but actually you're only going to be spared briefly, because we're going to talk, I'm just going to keep the two terms. Being per accidens and being per se. Okay, now the weirdest thing about this is what this accidental sense is. It's not the accidents. You kind of think, oh, well, this must be the 9 accidents, and this must be substance. It's not. Actually, there's 3 different kinds of being per se that Aristotle identifies. And the accidents go in the first one, which I'm just going to call categorical being. So what on earth is this? It has to do with not, I mean, if you think about the accidents down here, it'd be like quantity or quality. Say those considered in themselves. Up here it has to do with the relation between things. So we talk about the musical man. There's no essential connection between musicality and being a man. You can be a man, not be musical. Some you may have, you may not have. It's not something that's essential. Doesn't immediately flow from the essence. It's not like the triangle and the interior angles of 180 degrees. It's more like a triangle and the color orange. Could be orange, but the connection between the two isn't essential. It's just, it so happened that this triangle is orange. Doesn't follow from the nature of triangle. It's going to follow from some external agent who has decided to make an orange triangle. So this is a combination that is, well, not essentially connected. Or another example he'd use up here, the musician builds a house. One builds a house in as much as one is a builder. That's an essential connection. It just sometimes happens that you happen to be a musical person as well, and therefore we can make this statement, but it's through this just so happened that you were also musical. Okay, well, let's set that aside for the moment. So this is the important part. This kind of being. The second of this kind of being is being as true. Truth of propositions.
Sorry, Dr. Oliver, the explanation you just gave about like the orange triangle and the musician building, that pertains to being branched in. Okay.
Last we have act and potency as a way of dividing being. So as I mentioned in the last class, potency isn't privation. It has a privation attached to it, well maybe, but it's being, properly speaking. It's one of these being per se. It's just not actual being. Okay, so what we need to see, the important thing here is knowing these different kinds of being. This is definitely something I feel comfortable about testing you guys on. Ask you, what are the different senses of being that Aristotle identifies in Book 5, Chapter 7? The answer is this. Okay, now, metaphysics is a study of being as being, but being is said in many ways, namely these ways. And Aristotle is going to deal with these. This helps explain the structure of the metaphysics to a great degree. There's just some books that are just thrown in there, and but by and large, this is going to help us understand the structure. So with that, we can turn to chapter 6.
For these three things in chapter 5, would an explanation, so an explanation of A is necessary, but is it necessary to in-depth explain being as true and act in potency?
No, all I'm expecting you guys is just identify the names.
Okay.
And this, I mean, it's just categorical being. You got to know what it's referring to, and you have to be able to, say something about this. It's the connection that's found between two things that are not essentially related.
Okay.
So very little is needed for this. Moving to book 6. Now, in book 6, he begins, we divide it into 3 parts. Part 1 is an introduction where we're going to get information about the 3 theoretical sciences, Aristotelian theoretical sciences. So very briefly, we're going to talk about this today. I'll expound on that next time. Aidan, what are the 3 theoretical sciences?
Metaphysics, mathematics, and physics.
Good. So that's the first division. Then within these, we can subdivide them. But this first division is going to turn out to be done according to the degree of abstraction that's involved. More about that next time. Now, interestingly, here, he does not refer to metaphysics with his usual term. First philosophy, I'm not sure how often he's used that. But the important point is he refers to it as theology. And even though he does talk about the science of being as being, both at the beginning, where he says, we're seeking the principles and causes of things and of them as qua being, which I'm pretty sure, yeah, never mind. But he identifies it as theology, and he seems to think about, when he's talking about the different kinds, he identifies metaphysics as studying that which is separable from matter. So, physics studies what's not separable. Frogs. For Aristotle, frogs can't really exist without matter. There's no frog itself in the realm of the forms. And so when we define a frog, you got to keep matter in its definition. Mathematics can be defined without the specific kind of matter, because it doesn't matter what the triangle is made up of, whether it's bronze or iron or gold. But these mathematical entities cannot exist except in matter. They can be defined without matter, particular matter, sensible matter, but they can't exist apart from it. So there's also, just as there's no form of frog, there's no form of triangle itself subsisting out there. Well, the remaining type of science is identified as what's about that which can be defined apart from matter and can exist apart from matter. So as he presents it here, it looks like this is a science that has as its object God. Or maybe later you'd say, well, God and the angels. But then how is it a science of being as a whole? I thought that's what it was supposed to be about. So anyways, that poses a certain problem that later thinkers are going to have to grapple with and come to an answer with. And we'll see some of their answers. But here's one of the sources, potential source of the problem. Okay, so that's the first part of this chapter. In the second part, he takes up accidental being, this kind of being. So all the types of being are going to be taken up. This comes first. And he takes it up so as to explain why we don't have to treat of it. Why? Well, the answer is no science ever treats of the accidental. Now, for your purposes, that's all you need to know. So if I ask you, why doesn't Aristotle consider being as in its accidental? Well, the reason is that no science treats of it. If you want to say more, it doesn't properly have a cause. There's no proper cause of accidental being. There's a coincidence of causal lines, sure, but no proper cause for it. Then he turns to being as true, and it receives actually even less time. The very last chapter, chapter 4, and he dismisses it as well from consideration. Why does he dismiss it? Anyone remember?
Can you repeat that?
Why does Aristotle dismiss from any further consideration being as true?
Sorry, Dr. Alverman. Book 6, chapter 4.
Yeah. Page 782.
Okay, he says, towards the bottom of the page, that which is accidentally and that which is in the sense of being true must be dismissed. For the cause of the former is indeterminate, and that of the latter is some affection of the thought. And both are related to the remaining genus of being and do not indicate the existence of any separate class of being.
Okay, so what that amounts to is that truth is in the mind, and something is true or not in accordance with real existence. So it's a derivative kind of being. And so he's going to deal with what it depends on, real being. So yeah, that's the reason why it's dismissed. It's a derivative kind. He's going to study the primary kind. All right, so where do you get the primary kinds? Books 7 and 8 deal with categorical being, and book 9 deals with act and potency. So I gave you just tiny bits of reading. Now, I think books 7, 8, and 9 are the real heart of the metaphysics. So there's a bit of a shame that, this is all we're seeing of them. That said, they are fairly hard. And so there's not without reason that we've left these aside. So what does he say? Well, 7 and 8, even though they're supposed to be about categorical being, are all about substance. Because being is said in many ways, but one of these has primacy, namely substance, and it has primacy in definition, in order of knowledge, and in time. For the moment, let's just note that it has primacy, the primary sort of being. And therefore, the question about being, the question that was raised of old, and is raised now and always is the subject of doubt. What is substance? Aristotle's answer is going to be, in some sense it's the matter, in some sense it's the composite, but in the most important sense it's going to be the form. That's chapter 1. We're going to just spend our time looking at substance chapter. Chapter 2 identifies, basically sets the problem. So he presents what are commonly thought to be substances, namely bodies, animals, plants, their parts, elements, stars, moon, sun. Then he raises questions about these. Are all of these substances? Are these the only substances? Are there separate nonsensible ones like Plato thought? What about surfaces, lines, and points? Are those substances? Why on earth would you think they're substances? Because if you think the body's a substance, but then you think, well, it depends for its existence on the point, the line, and the surface, and therefore those must be even more so substance. Well, that's the line of reasoning you'd be using. So those are the questions he proposes, in a sense, promises to answer, and that's all I had you guys read. As for potency and act, just to wrap this up, basically tells us that we've completed speaking about substance, previous two books. Now we're going to speak about potency and act, first about potency, and so on. And then I had a tiny reading about act there, talking about the people who thought that you couldn't, unless you were acting, you didn't have the power to act. And so these guys failed to distinguish between potency and act, and that just leads to a whole lot of problems. And that's where we're going to end class. See you guys next time.
Thanks, Dr. Albert.